justice.
Yeah, okay, sweet. So we got through the introductions. I think going forward, it's important to keep in mind and remember the fact that we are here in a sacred space to discuss environmental justice and environmental racism. So I think starting with a definition of what is environmental justice and reminding those who already know is a good place to start. So environmental justice is fair treatment and involvement of people, regardless of race, income, color, where you may be from originally, your origin, with respect to development and implementation of environmental laws and regulations within cities, government of all scale.
Yeah, so we're going to go through some examples of environmental justice just to kind of clarify the definition a little bit. So one example that we thought of was farm workers across the United States. So they're primarily low income and also primarily Hispanic. So they're at an extreme risk of pesticide exposure because employers are benefiting at farm workers' expense by maximizing their own economic gain through less regulation. And another example is in the West United States, there are over 600,000 indigenous folks who live within 6 miles of an abandoned mine. And even though these mines are abandoned, the pollution that they create is still flowing through these indigenous environments. So it's contaminating the soil and the water and affecting all of the local plants and wildlife that are in that area.
And just to continue with some more examples, so the following quote is an excerpt from an interview with Dorcetta Taylor, a professor at Yale School of School of the Environment and author of Toxic Communities, Environmental Racism, Industrial Pollution, and Resident Mobility. So research has shown that if you have a corporation who has violated environmental laws, the corporation is going to be fined. However, the fines tend to be lower in communities of color, especially Black communities and poor communities. Corporations aren't idiots, they can see the difference. And another example would be Flint, Michigan. So back in 2014, the city switched the water supply from Detroit system to the Flint River, which was cheaper for the city. However, due to the inadequate water treatment and testing, the citizens of Flint dealt with a tremendous amount of health issues like rashes, itchy skin, and hair loss. Even the children were seen to experience developmental delays due to the exposure to the lead. So as you can see throughout all these examples, different groups of people are being disproportionately affected by environmental risks, and this ultimately leads to injustices. So like Gabe was talking before, so environmental justice, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So however, to achieve environmental justice, we must analyze the injustices being faced around the world, especially by communities of color, and dismantle the systems that feed off these vulnerable communities.
Yeah, so in this workshop, we're going to be analyzing the intersectionality that we need to connect environmental injustice and justice with immigrant rights. So while all of these examples were in the United States, environmental injustices are occurring around the world. And one key focus for this workshop will be immigrant rights in the clothing industry. So right now we're putting a link in the chat to a survey that will tell us where your clothes are from. So you can look at the tag on your clothing to determine what country it was made in, and then type in that location and place a pin onto the map. So we're going to give you a few minutes to do this and pay attention to what countries are most common. And if you're having trouble, we can try to troubleshoot.
Just to be clear, if you want to reload the page, you can submit multiple submissions. Like if you want to see maybe where your pants are from as well, your shoes, everything, your whole outfit, just for a broader spectrum of results. Okay, so hopefully as we start getting some results, I'm going to ask that, I agree with you, Olivia. I'm going to ask that Laura, if you could share your screen once some results start populating the map, just so we can get a visual of what's going on.
Can you see that okay?
Yeah, this is perfect. Okay, maybe take a few seconds more. Okay, all right. Chloe, go ahead.
Yeah. So does anyone know of any labor abuses that occur within the countries where the clothes have been made on the map? And do you notice any patterns?
And if you don't feel comfortable like unmuting yourself, you can definitely just drop it in the chat as well.
I'm just noticing a lot of our clothes are made in Asia, and I've heard many stories about the unfair labor practices in those countries.
Yeah, yes, Southeast Asia. Good observation. Olivia in the chat said a lot of these look like Global South. Yeah, Southern Hemisphere. Really good observation.
It also looks like most likely that they're in these countries, they're less stringent environmental laws. Therefore, it probably is easier for those manufacturing the clothes to get rid of the externalities with regards to pollution into the local watersheds or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else? Okay. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, Ms. Diaz. I can hand it over to Chloe and Ashley now.
Oh, wait, actually, sorry, I think it's me.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
My bad. So many people sometimes feel like disconnected from the issue of sweatshops because they're often associated with other countries or all the way back to the industrial age of the United States. This association comes from the 20th century when New York was still filled with sweatshops due to the little regulation of labor laws. These sweatshops were mostly filled with immigrants, women, and even children from low-income families. Then around 40 years ago, the apparel manufacturing industry began shifting to other countries, like we were seeing on the map, especially in Southeast Asia, where the laws aren't heavily enforced or they're honestly non-existent. So many assumed that clothing labeled like made in the USA means that the brands are better quality or have fair labor practices and are less environmentally harmful. However, this isn't the case. In fact, the US Department of Labor has found that 85% of all LA garment factories violate the federal wage and hour laws. So that would mean there are over 45,000 garment workers within the city's garment manufacturing sector. And the workers of these factories stitch clothes for some of the biggest and most successful brands that we see today, such as Revolve, Forever 21, Ross, and Fashion Nova.
Yeah, so to dive a little deeper into a specific brand, the Federal Department of Labor investigated Fashion Nova back from in 2016 to 2019 and found their workers are paid very illegally low wages. And the reason why this brand is able to produce so many new products so quickly and sell them for such low prices as well is because these workers are paid by the piece as compared to by the hour. So by the piece, meaning each part of a piece of clothing is equivalent to a few cents of pay. In addition to this, according to a survey conducted by the Garment Workers Center and UCLA Labor Center, factories are severely unsanitary. They're filled with vermin, dangerous in the sense that they have locked exits, and there's no workplace health and safety training prior to beginning work. So while these conditions are incredibly inhumane and really unfair, many of these garment workers are undocumented immigrant women who are hesitant to assert their rights due to very real things that happen even here in the United States, employer retaliation or consequences related to even immigration status. That could be either being arrested or deported or even being wrongfully deported to a country that you have no connection to.
Yeah, so kind of relating this back to environmental injustices in the workplace facing immigrant workers. Um, this has only been magnified recently through the COVID-19 pandemic. So an example can also be seen with Los Angeles Apparel. The founder, his name is Don Chovy. He was also the former owner of American Apparel. And he announced at the height of the pandemic that his company and his workers were busier than ever making reusable masks. But after an investigation, it was soon revealed by the LA Department of Public Health that their working conditions violated many infection protocols. Like they only had cardboard box barriers to separate the workstations, and the workstations were not 6 feet apart. And the LA Times stated that this company, Los Angeles Apparel, suffered the worst COVID-19 outbreak of any business in the country. So unfortunately, this is not an isolated instance for many immigrant workers in the United States. And this is just one example of how these workers are constantly disproportionately affected by environmental justices and face severe health consequences because of it.
So as we know, the immigrant worker population within the United States tends to be more people of color, the exact people that through these workshops we are trying to become better equipped and better educated so that we can advocate for them and help in any way we can. Additionally, the families of these immigrants, these people of color or lower income workers tend to be adversely affected by the pollutants and byproducts of these industries. So we would now like to direct your attention to this handy resource called CalEnviroscreen 4.0. And pretty much this resource is a mapping tool powered by ArcGIS, a platform that can be used from anything from website construction to mapping to even just simple visual relaying of information. So as any good environmentalist will tell you, the power of maps cannot be understated. It's because they are such a powerful but simple visual for relaying this information about concerned demographics and such. In this case, CalEnviroscreen is a map with layers embedded into it that measure all sorts of valuable data, such as exposure risk to various pollutants, to ethnic makeup of a census tract, and pretty much everything in between.
Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly go through this as kind of a tutorial. So this is the website for CalEnviroscreen 4.0. And before we kind of go and look at our own cities, we're going to talk about two communities that we chose to focus on. And I'm just going to give a quick overview. So if you scroll down, the map will pop up. And then this is kind of, you can see how there's red areas and green areas. So if we go to Richmond, California, it'll zoom in to the city. And you should see a different range of colors from green to orange to red. So you'll see that Richmond is split up, or all these cities are split up into subsections. So each subsection is called a census tract, and each one is a geographic area which has a population of around 4,000 people. So the green census tracts, like the ones down here, are pretty healthy. They have a low percentile in pollutants and environmental hazards, and they typically have higher rates of education and also higher socioeconomic status. And then these orange ones and red ones are kind of the opposite of that. So if you click on one of them, like if we click on one of these red ones here, you'll see a little pop-up and it shows some charts with percentiles. So the higher the percentile, the worse the condition of the census tract is. So the percentile tells us how much worse this specific census tract is compared to other census tracts in the state. So for instance, if we go maybe to cleanup sites for environmental effects, it's 99%. So that means that it's 99% worse than all the other census tracts in the state. So now we're going to use this resource and kind of look through our own cities.
Yeah, so we're going to take a few minutes to look through it. So navigate the source to a city or region that interests you, or the town that you live in. And we're going to talk about anything surprising that we see and why does this surprise you, and why might there be these kinds of rates of contaminants and pollution in certain areas.
Yeah, absolutely, Samra. You can adopt a city. Go ahead. Samra, you might find some interesting things if you check like Oakland or San Jose.
Okay, I'll take San Jose. I have a friend who lives there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right off the bat, does anyone see anything surprising about where they may be from? This could be anything such as like cancer rates, asthma rates. Are there a lot of cleanup sites in your city that you may not have known about? All right, just to get the ball rolling a little bit, while everyone still continues to poke through this resource, the city that I'm from, San Leandro, which is kind of sandwiched in between, if you're familiar with the Bay Area, Oakland, Alameda, and Hayward. Let's see, San Leandro has diesel particulate matter of 100%. So this means it's about the worst in the state in terms of particulate matter. And just being familiar with this area, I think that could be due to the Oakland airport that flies right over our city and kind of lands along the water, shore in Alameda, and that wind ends up blowing all those contaminants in that particular matter over into my city. Let me see. Furthermore, I think this is just something that's pretty general to the East Bay as a whole, but the percentile for lead from housing and in drinking water is also pretty high. I know that there used to be a lot of military base installations here that have permanently damaged the water for the foreseeable future. Yeah, Olivia. Huge difference. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, similarly in like Southern California, in Los Angeles, the asthma like percentile is always above 80%, especially in downtown. So there's a lot of health issues, especially with children down there. And for cardiovascular diseases, it's like 94 and above, I believe. So it's like you can very much compare just like the differing cities from NorCal too.
Yeah, yeah. Olivia, in those, if you feel comfortable talking, in those census tracts or neighborhoods that you checked out, if you scroll down towards the bottom of that pop-up, did you notice anything about the socioeconomics or even the racial makeup of these census tracts? Okay, awesome.
Also looking at SoCal, like I'm from San Diego and I checked out like specifically my neighborhood, and yeah, like comparing like unemployment rate and then like how it's divided by ethnicity too. It's like we have a big Hispanic population and the employment says 77, and then like comparing that to like other issues that go on, it's just like it's wild how like a lot of these things like overlap. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Tons of overlap.
Yeah, I was looking at Palo Alto and East Palo Alto, which if you scroll down to ethnicity and race, like you said, Palo Alto is overwhelmingly white and East Palo Alto is overwhelmingly Hispanic. And so it's, again, really, really telling of the situations in those cities that are like literally right next to each other.
Yeah, just on opposite sides of the freeway, you see like the deep green Palo Alto, whereas East Palo Alto is orange and orangish red.
Gabe, I looked at San Jose, and it's just fascinating that, again, like sort of going with what everybody else is saying, that the reddest areas, the worst environmental outcomes are where the majority population is Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
And the best, the green ones, like I can just put it there. I can say, okay, this is going to be not Hispanic majority. It just is. Like the greenest ones are either white majority or, in a way, not surprising because of the Silicon Valley, Asian Americans. So that's fascinating, that divide, a very clear, stark divide.
Yeah, yeah. I know Ashley did some background research on San Jose too. If you could speak to the huge language barrier within the community there too.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up actually, the linguistic isolation. Especially I was looking at San Jose specifically, but it's pretty bad because most of the population is Hispanic. So a lot of families are not able to speak English well and often have trouble talking to people who provide services like medical services or social services. So it's much harder to get the health care and the information that they need compared to a predominantly white community.
Yeah, I want to bring up something Noemi said. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. About how these census tracts would compare to something a couple decades ago, as well as the ethnic background.
Because like a lot of the debris and stuff are accumulated over decades
Yeah.
because it's been allowed to continue.
Yeah. Really good point. Really good point. Okay, so, all right, Chloe, do you want to lead some discussion? Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen. And this is just going to highlight some of the differences between Richmond and Palo Alto. Can you all see that? I mean, not Richmond and San Luis Obispo. Can you see the?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're good.
So yeah, we can talk about, you can also explore Richmond on your own, like with the maps. But we're going to talk about like why the differences are the way they are. So the map of Richmond is mainly red and orange areas, which indicate higher pollution burden. And as we've talked about before, Richmond is 60% Hispanic and 80% people of color. A lot of the residents there are immigrants, and undocumented immigrants make up to 14% of Richmond's population, which is a higher percentage than anywhere else in Contra Costa County. So this relates to the issue of immigration and workers' rights and environmental racism. So it gets more green and yellow in the areas close to the Berkeley Hills, just like how someone in the chat said, like the differences are so stark. And Berkeley is a wealthier and wider area than Richmond generally, so that can explain that. So getting into the history of Richmond, in, I believe, 1903, so before Richmond was even a city, a Standard Oil Company refinery was built in the area, and Standard Oil Company is now known as Richmond. So the development of Richmond as a city was shaped by this refinery's presence in the area. And there are also a lot of other polluting companies that are located in Richmond, and pet coke is transported through Richmond, so that explains the high levels of particulate matter in the air. And there have been several explosions and fires as a result of poor maintenance of the refinery's facilities, like fixing pipes that they knew were kind of leaky, and just negligence resulting in these fires. And the most recent fire, which was a really large fire in 2012, sent 15,000 residents to the hospital. So that's pretty shocking, and it demonstrates Chevron's, in my opinion, their low level of care for Richmond's residents and their emphasis on profit over people, especially when those people are not white and they're low income, which makes them more vulnerable to these kind of things and like less equipped to advocate for themselves. So this refinery and the fires and explosions coming from it cause pollution, obviously, which negatively impacts the health of residents, causing high rates of asthma and other respiratory problems and cardiovascular problems. And it, particularly affects children, which is obviously so unjust because they can't control where they live, and they're having like health problems because of it. So these industries employ many of Richmond's residents, so it creates this complicated kind of codependent relationship between the residents and the refinery, where a lot of them rely on the refinery for jobs while also suffering from the environmental impacts of it. So, some would argue that it's beneficial to the people in Richmond because it provides jobs for them, but I would disagree with that because it's very damaging to their health. And Chevron also makes up a large portion of the city's budget in taxes, so that gives it influence over the decisions that are being made in that city. So right now, like residents there are teaming up and trying to fight back against Chevron's influence, but it's definitely difficult. There's a power imbalance. So Ashley is going to compare it to San Luis Obispo.
Yeah, so we just wanted to quickly kind of compare because we saw a very stark contrast between the two cities. So obviously you can see in San Luis Obispo, it's super, super green. There's one yellow area. So it seems like a very, very nice place to live. And you can see the scores for the environmental effects range from 0 to 23, where if you go back to Richmond, it's 0 to 98. So San Luis Obispo is doing a lot better than Richmond in terms of environmental effects and health effects. So that just kind of goes to show how different communities are affected. And you can also see how San Luis Obispo is 62.9% white, so majority white, compared to Richmond. And that is not a coincidence.
Yeah, does anyone want to speak to why that may not be a coincidence? Can anyone notice key factor there? If not, it's totally fine as well. but how about, yeah, how about Ashley, you keep going. I'll share my screen right now. Here we go. Oops. Can you see my screen okay? Should be showing CalEnviroscreen.
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, so Richmond has much higher scores for socioeconomic factors. You can see for like education, linguistic isolation, poverty, unemployment, and housing burden. So this is a quote from Benjamin Chavis, an African American civil rights activist, but he defined environmental racism as racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movements. So, like we mentioned before, this data is not coincidental. This is the result of systemic racism. So, because of this systemic racism, ethnic minorities are more likely to be poor, and poor areas will receive less investment and environmental protections than higher income neighborhoods. So, the people who live there are also less equipped to advocate for themselves and push back against things like the fossil fuel industry, which helps explain why the pollution burden is so much greater in Richmond than it is in SLO.
Yeah, so after briefly examining some of the local examples of the fast fashion industry and the Richmond refinery, we can begin to understand how the populations at risk of facing labor abuses and unfair exposure to pollutants disproportionately affects people of color. So to drive the point home, these are environmental injustices happening within the workplace, within those communities, and all within the borders of our home state of California. So furthermore, we see how census tracts that are predominantly white don't have to worry about pollution, exposures, linguistic isolation, or poverty at the extremity that other communities do. So now we'll be going into how this all relates through the idea of intersectionality, but more specifically, how all these factors are influenced by each other.
Yeah. So can you all see my screen when I switch to this one, the house price index for California?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So depending on where your bar of faces are, the gallery, you might not be able to see the tail end of this graph, but yeah, let's cover some patterns of why we see white neighborhoods having lower contaminant exposure levels than census tracts of color. And as I'm talking about this housing price index graph will begin to make sense. So this kind of also ties into what Noemi was pointing out earlier. So it all starts with neighborhood design that has been implemented in any given city. For some cities, the plans might be more recent, but others have generally contained the same layout for anywhere of upward of 3 or 4 decades now. So what happens is that neighborhoods accumulate wealth over time. And when a neighborhood is made and is like brand spanking new, sometimes the only people able to afford these new residencies are of the higher or middle class and mobility. So as time goes on, their house and their entire neighborhood as a result accrues value and slowly becomes more expensive. Just to provide a personal anecdote, this is supported by the fact that I've seen the tremendous amount of inflation in the Bay Area in my own lifetime in the 20 years that I've been alive. I've seen what was once a neighborhood my grandparents could afford to move to here where I live as now a place where they can't afford. They waited just a few years too late and now they have to completely relocate out of the Bay Area and move away as far as Sacramento just because it's so expensive. And so tying into this housing price index graph, as you can see, according to this, the state of California, the median price of a home is approaching and somewhere teetering around $700,000, while the United States median is approaching $240,000. Huge discrepancy there. Furthermore, to drive the point home, California is home to 21 of 30 of the most expensive housing markets within the United States. So when demographics of higher socioeconomic status buy homes and raise the value of neighborhoods, of course, they're going to want to retain or increase their home value. they would never let their city council or local government implement anything that may harm their health or their property value. So this is where the NIMBY movement comes into play. Some of you might be familiar with that, but NIMBY is pretty much an acronym stating not in my backyard, which is when groups like a homeowners association galvanize and they create these large citizen network groups that pull together all kinds of resources, but mainly money. And they use this money to hire lawyers that represent their neighborhoods and their homes. And these lawyers ensure that they're opposing new development in their area that may be causing pollution. This in turn causes a combination of gentrification and displacement within cities and entire regions like we're seeing throughout the Bay Area. So then if they have these lawyers protecting their cities and their neighborhoods, where does this leave corporations and other polluters to settle for development? Neighborhoods that have low representation because they lack the money and the resources to advocate for social and environmental justice, thus being unable to keep polluters out of their area. And this is like a really unfortunate story. This is happening all over California.
Yeah, I think Naomi had a question in the chat for you, Gabe.
What is influence from the portion of people who have been privileged to long-term hunters? What do you mean by that, Naomi? Do you mind clarifying?
Like I think you kind of talked about it, but like when people are able to be like put down roots in their communities and then on top of that be able to like own their properties, like does that also have an influence on like participation in local government and like voting and like the, I don't know, not in my backyard type thing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It absolutely does. So they have more time to advocate for not allowing things like siting permits of these polluting industries, which is something that communities that haven't had as much time to settle their roots in, like you were saying, don't have. So very good question, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to, one more question from Sharon. Why don't cities like Richmond take more forceful action against companies like Chevron to ensure that Richmond residents are better protected against environmental injustice issues?
Yeah, so immigrant populations generally are working longer hours and commuting. So not only do they have less time, they also have less money, and they have less access to their local governments. But thankfully, in the case of Richmond, there are outside sources coming in to help and advocate for them. It's just unfortunate that people weren't doing it before and they weren't doing it fast enough. But that's typically the answer is money and time.
But I mean, don't the cities like Richmond, for the companies like Chevron to do business there, like they're given permits to do business there. So can residents through their votes, are you saying they don't have time to get out to vote to put in place at the city council level representatives that will advocate for them?
Yeah, so I think the answer to your question could be, and Laura, you can feel free to jump in too if you know a little bit more, just from you have more extensive background information on this. But essentially, how do I phrase this? Since they're stakeholders in that community, they definitely do have a say. Like you were mentioning, their local government, and as to like who gets these siting permits and who can be there and overall who can pollute there. But just in this unfortunate example, Chevron has been there so long, they've become like an impactful part of Richmond's economy. So it's not so easy to get rid of them. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question.
Well, not get rid of them, but use them to harness, because we know Chevron has deep pockets. So if you want to play ball Chevron, here's a list of a to-do list for you to, in order for you to stay here, you know, affordable housing, take pollutants out of the air, etc.
Yeah, that comes down to just communities being able to advocate for themselves. And in these immigrant populations, there's sometimes a language barrier, and that definitely has a part to play in it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I also just want to add that there are efforts like within Richmond to fight back against Chevron, and there are people running for local government, which have a lot of support among residents. But again, like not everyone's super engaged in politics. And there's, I think it's called the Richmond Progressive Association, which is like trying to do like raise money and support these candidates. But yeah, Richmond makes up a lot of the city's budget in tax dollars. So the city is probably inclined to support them. And like they are saying like things like they need to reduce pollution, like Chevron is trying to save face in that way, but like the existence of Chevron is, you know, it's going to be polluting if it's there. So can't do very much about the refinery being there and like not polluting.
Yeah, and also just like piggyback on like what is being mentioned here, like Chevron's a beast, and like the oppressive systems and structures that have allowed like polluting industry to like make home in vulnerable communities is like, yeah, these are part of like really oppressive structures, and like it shouldn't be incumbent upon like the victims of their pollution to like right their wrong. And so I think that's where like also policy is trying to address these issues, because like there's a bit of a catch-22, because Chevron does things like sends out checks to the residents when they emit too much sulfur dioxide, but they shouldn't be emitting at all, right? And like they're not actually then paying for like the healthcare bills of like the residents that are like overwhelmingly burdened with asthma, right? So
we can be part of the solution too with like our customer choices. I can't remember who said this, but we vote with our dollars for the type of world that we want. So if there's a resource that we could look up with regards to companies like Chevron, there are other choice. It's all about the choices that we make and these find from these companies.
Yeah, so we're actually going to kind of go into that a little bit. So we know that this is all kind of overwhelming information, and we don't want to kind of greenwash things or give a bunch of fluff to provide kind of a false sense of empowerment, since we realize that there's not really a clear one solution to fix all these issues. Otherwise, you know, we would have done it already. So right now, what we're going to do is we have a living doc, and we're going to use that to kind of work on some solution building together. And I think it was just dropped into the chat.
Yeah, so on this living doc, feel free to unmute yourself, type in the chat, or type directly into that doc. Any solutions that you think may be viable in terms of supporting these stakeholders, like people living there in the affected areas, how you can assist these lower income residents in getting past things like language barriers, forming advocacy groups, something so that their voice can be heard. So, and this doc is available for everyone too, so you can reference it whenever, and it is on the story map. I think we have the story map link also in the chat. Any of that stuff you can access anytime. It's yours, it's your information to have. Okay. So anyone want to start us off with a solution that you think maybe something tangible? Then we can start building from there. We can all chime in.
free education for the, or specifically about Richmond?
It could be anything, honestly. It could be a solution pertaining to anything we've talked
Okay,
about.
just because that's what we've been discussing,
Mhm.
because you've mentioned the language barriers. So just to ensure that they have adequate access to education, free, junior college, and some ability to improve their language skills so that they can be advocates for themselves. I'm sorry, every time I go to the link like that you put in the chat room, then I go off and I can't figure out how to get back to the Zoom meeting. So it's okay to just verbalize it like
Yeah,
this.
yeah, that's perfect.
Just to go off of that, I just want to highlight, like, it's so important to like use our platform, I feel like, to try and educate people on like the issues that are going on and like how they can like, how we can give them the tools they need to like advocate for themselves. Like Sharon was mentioning, I just wanted to highlight that again because it's super important.
Yeah, I also think that like addressing each issue that has to do with all of these, like, the issues intersect to create these unique problems. So like healthcare accessibility, I think, is important. Trying to just generally like fight racism and improve workers' rights and immigration issues, just all of that stuff has to do with this and plays a part.
I was thinking that a lot of neighborhoods where there's a major problem with air pollution, people who live closer to highways, I mean, these people aren't usually responsible for this pollution. It's people with more money, wealth, who are driving bigger vehicles, their SUVs, and they are the ones who are actually creating most of this pollution, right? So I think it's incumbent upon those people uh, to switch to cleaner modes of transportation, such as electric vehicles, and not just switch to personally to electric vehicles, but also push the local governments and say state governments towards electrifying transportation generally, so as to reduce the pollution burden on those communities.
Yeah, I think that has to tie into the idea of privilege of opportunity. So people just, wasting the privilege that they have and not
Right.
taking action.
Absolutely. Right, Gabe. That's perfect. That's a perfect phrase, Gabe, because I live here in New York, and I live on in a community. You could call it like a house on a hill or houses on a hill. Like if I turn my camera around, you'll see that there's this beautiful woods behind me and preserved land and everything. And I rent here, but the people who live here are very privileged people, and they have this beautiful surrounding area for their that's really personal, 170 acres that they all own together. And yet some of them have um, these big trucks and these quote unquote supercars that they drive, right? So it's funny how they've created this nice clean world so that their children can go into the backyards and camp there in their own woods and build teepees. And everybody's like, wow, that's so beautiful. And then they take out their vehicles and drive on roads to other people's neighborhoods so that and don't think about their children and their lives and their health.
Absolutely, that's a good point. One solution I see on here is electrifying the transportation fleet. I think that's a very viable solution. I know if you're familiar with the Bay Area, the island of Alameda has already begun doing something like that. They're well on their way to not only electrifying the public transportation fleet, but also creating hydrogen fuel cell buses. So they have greater charge than these electric buses. Let me see, zero interest loans for families to purchase EVs. Yeah, it's a solution. In response to solution 6, pressuring corporations into removing their influence from cities and the environment, does anyone want to speak to how we could do that specifically?
I mean, you can always boycott things, though it is hard to like boycott power in general, but yeah.
Absolutely. I think in that kind of situation, something like a NIMBY, not my backyard citizen group, although it has a bad connotation here in California sometimes, I do think, you know, that grassroots effort of people getting together and pulling their resources in order to threaten these corporations and pressure them. It's a really good idea.
And again, going back to your dollars in terms of consumption, voting with your dollars for the type of world that you want with the products that you buy, but also in investing too, you can put pressure on, you know, mutual funds to ensure that they're investing in companies that are not being, you know, gross polluters.
Absolutely, Sharon. Like, and I think we have more power there with like, as the divestment movement has shown us. I was just on a call a couple of days ago with Bill McKibben, and he was talking about some of that. And here in New York, we're working with the New York teacher retirement system. I'm a teacher, so we're saying, okay, let's divest our retirement money, our pension money from fossil fuels. It's a losing proposition, A. So it's the financial argument is bad, but it's a losing proposition for us as a community. And I think those are, like you said, are very powerful ways of actually getting some more momentum on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we near the end of our time, I'm going to post another link in chat. Just a quick survey. We'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to do that. But again, I do want to make sure we're ending right at 3. I know Chloe has to go to prom. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other time constraints. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
I just had a quick question. Is there a group on campus that we could be involved in to continue this conversation?
Ashley or Audion, you want to speak to that?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, Surfrider, I guess you could continue with these conversations, or like eco reps, but yeah, I don't know if
there are a ton of environmental clubs on campus. Our org that we're a part of is not a part of Cal Poly, but there are a lot of resources at Cal Poly if you wanted to look into those.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, and that concludes our third and final workshop of the day. Thank y'all for attending workshops throughout the day. If y'all have any questions, is there a way that we can contact you?
Yeah, in that survey, I think we may have put our contact information. If not, I feel comfortable putting my email in the chat, so I can go ahead and do that. Any of the other representatives of YCJ or ECJ want to do that, you can go ahead.
So those are ways you can contact them, as well as this session has been recorded and will be uploaded on the Multicultural Center's YouTube channel if you want to refer back to it. But yes, thank you all for attending Cal Poly's 4th Annual Students of Color Summit.
Thank you, everyone.